going to go ahead and get started, and if anyone else shows up, they show up. First of all, thank you all for coming. This is the second of our series we're trying to get going here on campus, a speaker series. We had one last month dealing with the comets that are going to be passing by Earth relatively close in the coming months. Tonight, we're doing history. Next month, we're doing philosophy and religion. Rich Edwards will be talking about the Muslim Brotherhood. And in May, we'll have Valerie Moranis-Pillmeyer talking about, I think, Irish literature, if I remember correctly. So some other things coming up, and we'll be resuming this in the fall. But as far as tonight goes, my name is Mark Karau. I'm the professor of history here on campus, primarily a modern Europeanist and especially a modern Germanist. And my current research deals with exactly why the Germans ended up losing the First World War, when tactically they did very well. Operationally they did very well, but in the end, of course, they end up losing. So what I've been looking at is what were the various factors that brought about that defeat, and a lot of my research of late has centered on the impact of the British naval blockade. So what I was going to talk to you about tonight for about the next hour or so was the blockade, or is the blockade, I should say, how it was implemented, what exactly it was, and then in particular, what impact did that have on Germany and the German war effort. These are just a few pictures to get us started. Most of you, or, well, maybe not, but many of you will hopefully recognize the guy over here on the right, Kaiser Wilhelm II. What's over there on the left you might not. Those are some shots of what was called the Dover Patrol. These were some lighter craft, mainly destroyers and torpedo boats, that were one of the critical forces implementing Great Britain's naval blockade. But to start us off, I want to talk a little bit about an American, a guy named Alfred Thayer Mahon. Anybody heard of him? No? He was a professor at the Naval War College in the 1890s who did a lot of research on the impact of naval power, sea power, during the course of the Napoleonic Wars. And he came down on the side of arguing that Britain won the Napoleonic Wars precisely because of their navy. And he began arguing that if you wanted to be a great power, you had to have a great navy. What that gave rise to was a lot of battleship building that helped bring about the First World War. It also turned out to be proven correct by the way the war turned out. British naval power played a significant role in the outcome of this conflict by allowing Great Britain to bring in supplies from the United States, from the British Empire, while being at the same time able to completely cut Germany off from contact with the outside world. So just a brief introduction here about Mahon and the importance of naval power historically. That was also borne out in the two previous wars that came between when Mahon wrote his book, which was called The Influence of Sea Power on History, written in 1894, and the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Those were the Spanish-American War in 1898, where we took control of the seas and we defeated Spain, and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, where the Japanese controlled the seas and defeated the Russians. So a little bit of background here about blockades and naval blockades so that we know what we're talking about. The blockade as a tool of war had a long history, especially with the British Navy. They employed it not only against Napoleon and during the French Revolution, but they employed it in their 18th century wars against France. They employed it all the way back into the 17th century, the 1600s. And there was a long history, a legacy of international law built around the idea of a blockade. It's designed, of course, to stop trade going into belligerence, but what about neutral countries? Where do they factor into it? So there's this legacy of international law, and in order to have what was called a legal blockade, traditionally, you had to have what was called an effective blockade. What that came to mean in terms of international law was that you had to put your ships directly outside the opponent's harbor. You couldn't blockade them from a distance, from, say, the Dover Straits. You would have to sail directly to Calais and put your ships off the port of Calais so that you could intercept ships that were sailing directly into that port. That was traditionally the way that things were done. That was an effective blockade. If you weren't doing that, then it was generally considered that you were illegally declaring a blockade but not really implementing it. It's esoteric, but it matters because the British don't do this during World War I. They instead launched what's called a distant blockade, and that led to a lot of problems initially between them and the United States. What are you doing in a blockade? You're stopping your opponent from getting goods. In particular, you're stopping them from getting contraband, war-making materials. This can be broadly defined or it can be narrowly defined. Some things are obvious. What's a war good, a war material? Guns, steel. Other things, not so much. The big question for World War I was food. Did food count as contraband? Did that count as a war good? The British argued it did. The Germans argued it didn't. Definitions of contraband change as this war goes on. They start off being fairly specific to things like steel and coal and iron and actual weapons. And the British gradually will push that category of contraband wider and wider as the war goes on, so that it encompasses things like nickel and tin and cotton, fertilizers, and eventually food. There's also a question when you're talking about blockades of neutral rights versus belligerent rights. What are the rights of a neutral nation to carry on commerce with warring countries? And how do those rights conflict with the rights of a belligerent to stop that neutral commerce with their enemy? This is a classic debate between the United States primarily and Great Britain on the other side, usually. We fought a war over this, the War of 1812, all the way back in the earliest days of the country. The U.S. had traditionally argued that neutral rights trumped belligerent rights. Neutral ships meant neutral goods. If we're not at war, we should not be limited in our commerce. The British have always argued belligerent rights were more important. We're at war. We can't let you strengthen our enemies. That will play a role during the course of this war as well. The last question is this idea of close blockade or effective blockade versus a distant blockade. Traditionally, what the British had always done was a close blockade. They would sail right up to the enemy harbor. They stopped doing that during World War I because of new weapons systems, because of the torpedo primarily. The older fortifications for these ports, you could stay far enough offshore that you couldn't be hit by artillery fire, by cannon fire, and you could still have a close-in effective blockade. With the advent of the torpedo and small, fast torpedo-carrying ships, that becomes much more dangerous. And the British, during this war, will implement a distant blockade. Brief map of World War I era Europe. What you're looking at here are the basic alliances, Triple Entente in the lighter colors, and the Central Powers in the darker blue that you can't really tell all that well between Switzerland and the Netherlands and the lighter blue and the darker blue. Central Powers is basically Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, Turkey. Where the British implement their blockade line is partly here in the English Channel. This is where the Dover Patrol primarily operated. Not only in the Dover-Calais Straits, but further out here into the western approaches of the Channel as well. A second blockading line of cruisers was established to the north in between the Shetland Islands and Norway. Both areas had to be closed. This was obviously much easier to close than that, simply because of geography. The real purpose of this line here was to intimidate neutral countries into sending their shipping this way so it'd be easier to catch and stop. The British also controlled Gibraltar and therefore controlled the entrance to the Mediterranean. The map key is over the top of Gibraltar. And off here, they controlled the Suez Canal, which meant they, in effect, could close the Mediterranean, and by closing the channel in the North Sea, could basically close off all of the German coastline. This is what they choose to do. They implement a distant blockade. Questions so far? All right. They implement the blockade immediately. The war breaks out in August of 1914. Germany declares war on Russia on August 1st. Britain ends up declaring war on Germany on August 4th. Before August is over, the British are sending out the Royal Navy to implement this blockade. Initially, as I said earlier, they're aiming this at traditional weapons systems, traditional types of contraband, and they broaden that as the war goes on. There is immediately neutral resistance to this blockade. The neutral countries, especially places like the Netherlands and Denmark, get caught up in the blockade because they happen to border on Germany. There's one probably fairly obvious potential loophole to the blockade if you don't include those neutrals. What is it? Any ideas? If you're Germany, where's your loophole if those countries aren't also blockaded? Well, you could go to Russia, but Russia's at war with you. You just buy from Denmark and the Netherlands. You increase your imports from them. If they're not blockaded, they start buying more, and you get it from them. So the British end up basically blockading the neutrals as well. But the big country that really resisted the blockade was the United States. We entered the war eventually in 1917 against Germany. In 1914, we were more angry at the British than we were at the Germans. And it was because of this blockade. The British were trying to cut American trade off with Germany. We had done booming business with Germany in the years prior to the war. They were one of our major trading partners, and the British were now cutting us off. Between 1914 and 1916, there's a push and pull between the United States and Great Britain that really limits the effectiveness of this British naval blockade. The British try and tighten the blockade. We push back. They loosen it. They come back later. They try and tighten it again. The U.S. pushes back, and this keeps going on. The blockade is run by a central British committee, the Blockade Committee, through the Royal Navy. Its job, number one, is to actually give the orders to the ships. Number two, to decide what is and what is not contraband. And then number three, to try and deal with the neutrals. I'm going to go through fairly quickly here some of the things that are done because I want to get to the heart of this, which is talking about what did the blockade actually do to Germany. The major neutrals surrounding Germany do, at the very beginning, actually become, well, the Germans use the term a windpipe, sort of a breathing apparatus for Germany to evade the blockade. And that does work for the Germans for a time. All of those surrounding countries increase their imports from the United States in particular to a pretty substantial level. The Netherlands did it to the greatest extent. The Netherlands, their imports from the United States jumped 600% in 1914. Obviously, there's something going on here, so the British decided they had to include and tighten the blockade on the Netherlands. They did this in several ways. What they eventually came to do was to ration all of these neutral countries. By 1916, what the British were doing was looking at how much these countries imported in peacetime and limiting their increased imports to a slight percentage above their peacetime imports. And the idea here was to try and limit what they could then ship off to Germany. The U.S. always pushed back on that, which made this less effective than it could have been. Another way in which the British tried to tighten their blockade was through controlling supplies of coal. In the World War I period, almost all the ships involved used coal as their fuel. Some of the really modern British vessels had gone to oil, but the vast majority were still coal burners. The British controlled most of the naval bases, most of the coaling stations, and as a result, they tried to use that control of coal to leverage greater participation on the part of the neutrals in the blockade. Joe?
So would a blockading neutral countries be a cause for war, or do these neutral countries just kind of have to take it as Britain was survival?
It would be a casus belli, yeah. It could be an excuse for war, absolutely. The Netherlands, however, the Netherlands or Denmark really, don't really want to get involved in this war because they have far more to lose than they do to gain. If you're the Netherlands and you go to war with Great Britain, what does that really get you? Not very much. You know, the Germans are probably going to move in and help defend you, but what are you really going to accomplish? You don't have much of a navy. And they did still have a colonial empire that they could lose. Same problem with Denmark. They didn't have a colonial empire, but what is war against Britain going to gain them? Nothing. So as one of these small neutrals, you basically take it. Or you appeal to the United States, a powerful neutral, to stand up for you. And that's where the British had to move fairly carefully. They had to tread carefully around the United States, because if they really offended the United States, it's theoretically possible you could end up in another war of 1812. And the British did not want to have that happen. It's not realistic. Woodrow Wilson wasn't going to war against Great Britain over the blockade. But you have to be a little more careful when the neutral's a lot more powerful. Good question. Carl?
Where are the Germans getting the coal from? It's being imported? Is that one of the
Oh, I'm sorry.
products?
I'm not being clear.
They have a pretty large domestic source that they're going from.
What the British are doing with the coal supplies is not directed towards the Germans at all. It's directed towards the neutrals. I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm not.
Where is the coal coming from that's going to Germany? If it is going to Germany.
It's not going to Germany.
It's not, I was going to say, because Germany has quite a bit of coal.
Right.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm not being clear. I need to clarify this. What the British were doing was called bunker control. And they were using their control of the coal supply for these neutral ships to limit what they would take to Germany. In other words, you're a Dutch merchant captain. You need coal to fuel your ship. You buy that coal primarily from the British. So what the British are doing is deciding how much coal are we going to let you buy if you're going to be doing business with Germany. If you want to trade with Germany, well, then we're going to limit how much coal we're going to let you buy from our shipyards because we want you voluntarily participating in this blockade so that we don't really have to exert a lot of control We want buy-in. So we're going to hit you economically by not letting you buy as much coal.
And Germany was not supplying the neutrals with coal. I hate to belabor this, but I'm just really interested in this.
No, that's fine. They could, for the Netherlands and Denmark, going out,
Yeah.
but not coming back.
Yeah.
Because on the way back, there aren't any German bases out there. They've all been taken by the British as the war goes on. Good questions. Other questions? Just as a side note, there was also a system called Nava-certing that the British used, which with the United States. They wanted the U.S. to get buy-in too, but a lot of our companies wanted to keep doing some business. So what they had us do was promise not to trade with Germany, and then American companies would get a little certificate called a Certificate of Navigation, a Navicert. And then you could go wherever you wanted to go. So all you had to do was promise you're not going to go to Germany, and then you were free to do what you wanted. Well, a lot of Americans traded with Germany anyway. From 15 to 16, really 14 to 16, this thing isn't all that effective. It does have some impact, as we'll see, but it's not all that effective until 1917. What allows the blockade to really bite home is when the United States enters the war against Germany. We do that because of the submarines the Germans began using. Anybody familiar with this stuff at all? The unrestricted submarine campaign? A little bit? So the Germans are sinking all of these ships in the waters around Great Britain, and sometimes American ships, and as a result, the U.S. ends up declaring war on Germany. When that happened, all of that American resistance to this blockade went away. And the shutters came down. Everything got cut off. All imports beyond peacetime levels to Denmark, to the Netherlands, to Norway, to Sweden, all of those came to an end, and the blockade became far, far more effective once the U.S. was involved. German vulnerability to the blockade. What does Germany need? How and why, where, I should say, are they really vulnerable? As Karau has mentioned, they're not vulnerable in coal. Germany produced enormous quantities of coal. They also had a substantial supply of iron, because their primary source of iron wasn't really touchable by the blockade. It came down from Sweden. And the British are not trying to blockade in the Baltic. So in iron and coal, Germany was all right. But there were a lot of other areas where they were not. Military goods as well as civilian goods. One area where the Germans were really vulnerable was in cotton. Imports of cotton coming primarily from the Middle East and from the United States. And cotton ends up being made contraband. It does have some military purposes, but mainly it was proclaimed contraband just to provide greater hardships for Germany. I'll give you a few quick statistics here. The Germans get cut off from their cotton imports even before the U.S. comes in. And the German textile industry sees a 90% decline in their output by 1917. Almost the entire textile industry gets shut down. They convert a little bit to wool, but they don't have tremendous amounts of wool either. During the entire war, the Germans produced 22,000 tons of woolen textiles. That's it. They eventually, because they didn't have cotton, they didn't have wool, they experimented with things like flax and hemp and even at one point nettles, trying to convert nettles into clothing fibers. And eventually they went to paper. By late in the war, 1918, the German people are wearing clothing that is created from paper fibers, which is a problem when it rains. Your clothes can sometimes literally melt off your body And there are stories of this happening in Germany. That was one area. Some industrial metals, copper. Germany was cut off fairly quickly from copper. They produced about 40,000 tons of their own. They used more than 200,000 tons a year. That other 180,000 tons is all imported. Copper is recognized immediately as contraband. Even the U.S. supports that. So they're cut off from that very quickly. As you might guess, rubber is not something that is produced in vast quantities in Germany in the early 19-teens. There's no synthetic rubbers at this point. They're first being developed. So rubber, also recognized as contraband, that's cut off almost immediately. Other goods, nickel, tin. These are things that were used primarily for the military, but also for civilians. And a major one, fertilizers. Nitrogen fertilizers and phosphorus fertilizers. The Germans imported, in 1913, the last year of peace, over 700,000 tons of nitrates from South America. Nitrates, of course, are used for explosives, so they're contraband. But they're also used for fertilizers, which means your food supply is going to be hit by not being able to bring in enough nitrates to keep fertilizing your soil. I'll give you some statistics here in a little bit as to how all of this impacts German agriculture. The nitrates almost on their own could have paralyzed the German war effort. They were saved by a chemist, Fritz Haber. Anyone heard of Haber? He developed something called the Haber process right before the outbreak of the war, which allowed German scientists to pull nitrogen out of the air and create some of the nitrogen that they needed. Without that, this war might not have lasted until 1918. It may well have ended in 15 or 16. How do the Germans respond to the blockade? Really in three ways. I already mentioned one of them. They increased their imports from the neutrals, as long as the U.S. let them do so. The other two ways they responded was by rationing what goods they had and through what's called ersatz production or synthetic production. Synthetic nitrogen, and eventually, as the war goes on, synthetic rubber. Recycling also factors in. The Germans rationed all of these goods, and they rationed them based on what you did within German society. Those who got first call on the rations, whether it was food, whether it was supplies, were the military. The soldiers, the sailors, they got first dibs. Then you had those who were working in the munitions plants. And then everybody else kind of got what was left. Ersatz production, the Germans used replacements for everything. Ersatz bread, ersatz sausage, ersatz beer. Ersatz became a curse word by the end of the war, and I am not joking. The Germans came to hate anything ersatz because most of it was junk by the end of 1918. Early ersatz bread was potato bread. Not all that terrible. Anybody had it? My grandparents used to make it. It was a big deal, potato bread. I wasn't a big fan of it. I would have wanted to eat mostly that for 4 years. But it wasn't awful. But they also then began mixing in other things. And by 1918, one of the fillers in the ersatz brot was quite literally sawdust, because they had to find something to kind of throw in to fill in the bread. Blood sausage was another replacement product. Some of you probably had blood sausage. That was something that was created because there was such a low supply of meat. This was something that would kind of stretch your meat diet a little bit. So what is the impact of the blockade? What exactly happens to Germany as a result? We'll look at imports, we'll look at military production, And then we're going to look at where it really, really bit home and had its biggest effect on the German food supply. Imports, first off, just a sort of a general picture. The value of German imports and exports between the last year of peace and the end of the war. And I think the numbers are pretty clear, at least in one regard. There's a major decline on both sides of the ledger. The German merchant marine was the first victim of the blockade. By the end of 1914, the merchant ships had been swept from the seas. They were either back in Germany huddled in port, or they were huddled in various neutral harbors. And as a result, anything being exported had to go through neutrals, and everything being imported had to come through neutrals. The German imports declined to a little bit less than half by the end of the war, and the exports are down to about a fifth. Part of the export problem is blockade, but that's not the whole story. Another part of the export problem is that they're not producing as much for export. They're producing more for the war. More specifically, I want to look at production. German coal and steel, we've already said, weren't really all that affected by the blockade. But they were affected, at least to a degree, by the war. The Germans produced a fairly stable supply of coal throughout most of the war. It's down a little bit from peacetime. That's mainly because a lot of the coal miners get drafted off into the army and they're sent off to go fight in the trenches. So you have less production. Steel ends up being reduced. A couple things going on here. To a certain extent, there's a little bit of an impact of the blockade. Again, a large part of it, though, is really economic mismanagement and a decline in the number of workers in the steel plants. Here's where we really start to see impacts from the blockade. I'll just give you a few minutes to digest the numbers here. I think they're pretty dramatic. 1913, again, last year of peace. This is what the German farmers were producing in thousands of metric tons and how they decline as the war goes on. Corn production pretty much ceases. It's not being grown. It wasn't a big product before the war, and it's pretty much stopped as the war goes on. Wheat declines to about half, rye, barley, half, oats, more than half, potatoes, again, just about half, pretty much across the board. Production is declining about 50%. Karau?
Yeah, I just had a quick question, because on the previous graph you had too, or table rather, there's an increase, 1914, and then there's a decrease in 1915, then it actually increases a bit.
Yep.
In 1916, and we see that with oats. We see that with steel and coal. Yep. And then we see it with oats, and I can't recall if there was another product.
There is another one.
I was wondering if there was a particular...
There is.
Okay.
What is happening here in 16 and 17 is a change in the way the Germans are running their war economy. In 14 and 15, when the war started and throughout 1915, they didn't try to centralize any of their production. They tried to just give out orders as they did in peacetime. It didn't really work all that well. So in 1916, they began centralizing through the government, through basically a ministry of munitions like the British did, their steel and coal production. So that's what you're seeing here. This is a little bit different. You're looking at, I think, the oats, right?
Yeah, that's the one I was curious about. Or it could just be a coincidence, too, I suspect. But
no,
that's a pretty big increase, though. A dramatic drop and then a pretty relatively significant increase after the drop.
Yes. What's happened there is that in 1916, the Germans were able to overrun Romania and they pulled in some of the Romanian food supplies, and that's included here in the chart. So there's some territory that was newly conquered that the Germans were exploiting. This shows the impact on imports of the U.S. entering the war. Germany's imports in 1916 in terms of grains, meat, butter, all of these various categories, most of this coming through the neutral countries. It's not coming directly into Germany, it's coming into Holland, it's coming into Denmark. And then the U.S., as I say, puts the brakes on everything. And you can see dramatic reductions in what the Germans are able to actually import. Question? No? A big part of this production decline has to do with, again, the fertilizer problem, the shortage of fertilizers. There's not really a shortage of labor on the farms. Most of the draftees came from factories. They did not come from farms. So there's labor in the countryside all the way through. It's mainly a lack of fertilizer and also a lack of fodder for livestock, so the livestock aren't as strong. They're not able to work as hard. And as the war goes on, their numbers decline too, though not as precipitously and not directly due to the blockade. I want to give you a few more quick statistics here as to how this actually affects the civilian, the ordinary German civilian, in terms of what they're eating and how they're surviving. By 1918, the daily ration for German civilians, what you are allotted, not necessarily what you get, but what you're allotted, what you could have maximum, was about 12% of your peacetime level in terms of meat, 28% of your peacetime level in terms of butter, 15% in cheese, 13% in eggs, about 48% or so in bread. So you still have a sort of reasonable bread diet. The one of these things you could actually have quite a bit of was potatoes. You'd have 94% of your peacetime norm in potatoes. But I stress that's what you were allowed. It's not necessarily what you got. The Germans did not gather all this together and then distribute it through major distribution centers. You were given coupon books. And you would go to the bakeries, you'd go to the grocer, and you would present your coupon book for however much you were allotted that day, if they had any left. Because people were going out early in the day. If you got there a little bit too late, there might not be anything left. And even though you're allotted this amount, you may not get it at all. You may end up with nothing. The whole system the Germans had really was decentralized for much of the war and somewhat chaotic. I don't have a lot of time to dive into that, but it was, there's some economic mismanagement that plays a role here too. We'll leave it at that. The diet, the average caloric intake, was down to less than 1,000 calories a day by 1918. For the Entente, the opposition, the British, the French, the Italians, they had a slight reduction. Their average caloric intake before the war was 2,200 calories. By about 1918, they were down to about 1,950 or so. So not terrible, but a small reduction. The Germans are down below 1,000. Production gets so bad, in particular in terms of barley, that by the end of 1916, about 75% of Germany's breweries were shut down. And those that were still producing it were producing ersatz, replacement beer, which was basically a really, really light, watered-down version. I hate to offend anybody, but kind of like Budweiser, the American version, as opposed to like real German beer. Any Bud fans? Have I?
Dear God, it's no wonder they lost the war.
Yeah, I make that comment in in the First World War class. You get to this point, and it's like, you know things are really bad when the Germans have to stop producing beer. And all joking aside, in 1917, the beer supply was earmarked just for the army. And only soldiers were entitled to beer in 1917 and 1918. The ordinary German civilians got to go without. I'm sorry?
So you've had a lot of people join the army?
Well, there are already quite a few who are there or they've been drafted. The decline also does great damage to the price structure. The German government tries to control the food supply, and they generally don't do a very good job of it. The Germans had a thriving black market for most of the war, and prices were very highly inflated. Even for those who weren't on the black market, inflation drove the average Berliner from spending 23 marks a month on food before the war to spending 65 marks on food during the war every month. For most Germans, their salaries, their wages did go up a little bit, but not enough to keep up with that price increase. That's the official market. On the black market, things are much worse. Again, a few quick examples for you. In peacetime, a dozen eggs on the Berlin market cost a little bit less than 1 mark. 1918, those dozen eggs cost 17 marks on the black market. A half kilogram of butter before the war, again, about 1 mark. 23 marks on the black market by 1918. A kilogram of meat that would have cost about 3 marks before the war was going for 28 marks on the black market. So if you've got the money and you can afford to get things on the black market, you're a little bit better off. Most people didn't have access to that. This collapse of the food supply left most Germans losing between 20 and 33% of their body weight over the course of the entire war. Some did better than others. Some of their enemies said it was good for them because they were too fat before the war. But there were a lot of Germans who lost significant body weight. And this made them more susceptible to disease. Another impact of the blockade, I don't have a chart for it, but there's a great increase in the outbreak of things like rickets and scurvy and dysentery and other sorts of intestinal diseases. And not only nutrition-related diseases, but there's a general rundown of the body from lack of nutrition, which made other diseases more virulent. You've probably heard of the major influenza outbreak of 18 and 19. The Germans were hammered by this influenza outbreak, worse than almost anybody except for the United States. Tuberculosis became a huge problem within Germany. The overall German mortality rate went up, and this is for civilians, not soldiers, went up by about 51% over the course of the war. A lot of historians have tried to figure out exactly how many people were killed by the blockade. There are a lot of differing estimates. These are some of the more conservative ones. German civilian deaths in excess of peacetime. The way this was figured was by going through mortality rates and simply looking at how the mortality rates increased and how that corresponded to the tightening of the blockade. So you see a major increase in 1918. That's due to malnutrition. It's also due very, very heavily to the influenza outbreak. So what is the role of the blockade in Germany's ultimate defeat? What's the impact here on the German war effort? On the home front, was pretty brutal. When the war broke out, German society pulled behind the Kaiser. Everyone got behind the army, and they supported the war. You may have heard the stories or seen the pictures of cheering crowds in the street. There's one really famous one taken in Munich, where if you look really close, you can see a young Adolf Hitler out in the crowd. There are a lot of scenes like this. Germans celebrating almost the outbreak of the war. They proclaimed what they called the Bergfrieden, the peace of the fortress. They put aside their political differences. The socialists worked with the conservatives. Everybody kind of pulled together for the war effort. And that lasted down until about the end of 1915, the start of 1916. And then the impact of the blockade started to really be felt. And that cultural consensus in favor of the war started breaking down. That spreads to the army. It spreads to the army because the soldiers go home and they start seeing how hard things are for their families back home. Throughout the war, the soldiers always ate better. As I said, they got the beer, so they got better treatment. But they go home and find out just how bad things were for their families, and then they'd have to go back to the front lines and continue a war that really didn't seem to be getting anywhere. So the loss of the food supply caused by the blockade really began deteriorating the morale, not only of the civilians, but also of the soldiers. There's also an impact, a lesser one, but an impact on the weapons. German industry, you saw the statistics for coal and iron, coal and steel. So there's a little bit of a decline, but they're still producing these goods in fairly significant quantities, but not nearly to the rate that their enemies are. The British, in particular, did an excellent job in this war of managing their economy, harnessing their raw materials, and producing far more shells than the Germans did. They also had the advantage of being able to buy goods from the United States. And we began ramping up our war industry to sell to Britain and France even before we were in the war. The Germans are outgunned badly by 1917 and 1918. They simply do not have the same supply of munitions that their opponents do. For example, the Battle of the Somme, fought in 1916. Before the British launched their offensive there, they bombarded the German trenches almost 24/7 for about 10 days. The Germans could not muster anywhere near the amount of artillery shells that would have been necessary to do something like that. That too impacts your morale. When you know the enemy has vastly greater firepower than you do, how do you really continue to stand up against that? This is a question that has been debated, and historians still argue over it. How important was the blockade? A lot of military historians argue that it really wasn't all that significant. That because the Germans were still able to produce the coal and the iron and the steel, that they weren't really all that badly impacted. What I've seen suggests a different conclusion. It suggests that this blockade was extremely damaging to Germany's war effort, if for no other reason than from the food supply. The numbers that I put up of the increased deaths, as I say, those were conservative. I have some others. Let me give them to you here quickly. This is a separate historian, and his figures, most historians consider them to be a little bit high, but they're still in the ballpark. He puts the deaths attributed to the blockade as at about 700,000 over the entire course of the war. If you take that into account, And you look at as well a decrease in the birth rate, which also happened because of the low food supply. What you end up with is Germany having about 3 million fewer births over the course of the war than what they would have had in peacetime, for a grand total of a potential loss of people, including the soldiers who actually died, of about 6 million. Pretty devastating numbers. That's about 10% of the German pre-war population, which was about 66 million. That ultimately is the biggest impact. It's the food supply and the decreasing ability of the German population to withstand disease and to continue resistance in the war. We started with Mahon, and I'm going to end with him. I would argue that what the war demonstrated is that Mahon was still right, and that sea power once again played a very critical role in the outcome of another major military conflict. The British had access to things the Germans simply did not have access to. Other historians have argued German mismanagement played a bigger role. They mismanaged some things. There's no denying that. But I think the blockade forced many of those decisions, and that made the impact of the blockade worse. Questions? That is what I have. Questions or comments?
I have one more question. What were they exporting? You showed a...
Oh, sure. Yeah. They're still exporting some very, very limited consumer goods. There was a small consumer industry all the way through the war. Things like, this seems stupid, but things like cuckoo clocks, from the Black Forest, are still being exported to Switzerland to get foreign exchange. So there was still a little bit of that.
And most of the exports are going to the neutral countries, I would presume?
They're all going to the neutrals, yep.
And later has involved.
I don't know about that for certain, but I wouldn't. Yeah. But Once you get rid of the beer, what are you really? That's a great question. Once you get rid of the beer, what's left really to export? And there were some civilian industries, but there's so many things that are in such short supply. Leather was in short supply. They imported a lot of that before the war, so a lot of I think I have a statistic here. It's something like 1,100 of the 1,800 German factories that made shoes before the war were shut down by 1917 because there just wasn't enough leather. There's no need to be in business. And people were wearing shoes that they had bought in like 1913, and they're patching them together as best they can to try and keep them in functional condition. There are stories of ersatz shoes, which were basically, cardboard strapped to wood. They were very creative. They did a lot of things to try to deal with some of the shortages, but it really devastated the economy, in particular by 17 and 18. The breakdown in the consensus in favor of the war really comes to a head in January of 18, and there are massive strikes that take place in most of the major cities of Germany. And they're not strikes for better pay. These are strikes for get us out of this war, end this. We're not going to win it, and we want to get out. The German response to those strikes tended to be counterproductive too. They drafted a lot of the strikers into the army and shipped them off to the front lines, where now they're telling the guys they're fighting with, we really ought to end this war.
So what's a strike, basically? Demonstration? I mean, how do they actually put
Workers
the word into practice?
walking off the job. These were organized by the unions, workers leaving the factories and taking to the streets in places like Berlin in the hundreds of thousands, orchestrated by their union leaders who were oftentimes working with the Social Democratic Party. The Social Democrats were trying to push for a war of a peace of reconciliation. Let's not fight to annex territory anymore. Let's just say end the war.
And they thought that by walking off the job that the industries would force the issue? I mean, or was it just the impact of the demonstrations?
Well, that's what they're hoping, yeah. They're hoping that the demonstrations will persuade the government to seek a lenient peace as opposed to a victor's peace. There's another, that debate kind of factors into this too. The Germans, what are they fighting for? And there were military leaders in particular who really wanted vast expansion. They wanted to really push the borders far into Russia. They wanted to keep Belgium. They wanted to annex parts of France. Now, they're not the only ones. The Allies had a lot of those same aims. But what the socialists and the unions began arguing for by 1918 was, forget about that. Just stop. Just end the war. We don't care if we get anything. We just want to be able to eat again. And we don't want our family members getting butchered over there in the front lines, really for nothing. Good question. Other questions? Yeah.
How would you, modern day blockades in the last 20 years,
Sure.
how would you compare this, or effective or ineffective? Now, like for instance, Iran, country like Iran,
Yeah.
to try and isolate.
Or Cuba. You know, we've been blockading Cuba since, what, 1960, I think? They're different in degree, in that they're a lot looser. There's a lot more stuff that gets through these modern blockades because we're not in an open war situation. So, for example, we don't trade with Cuba, but a lot of other countries do. And we're not really blockading them because we're not stopping these other countries from shipping their goods in. Iran, there's a little more buy-in from other countries, so it's a little bit tighter. But it's probably more accurate to call it an embargo than a strict blockade. And again, the looseness of it, letting more stuff in, weakens the effectiveness. You also have situations, though, in a place like Iran, where you have a totalitarian enough regime and a population that's been living with shortages for quite a while, that it's easier to deal with the shortages caused by a blockade. Whereas the Germans, prior to World War I, lived pretty well. They ate well. They probably were a little overweight. You know, their enemies weren't entirely wrong on that. But they ate well. They had a nice standard of living, and life was pretty darn good for most Germans. And then you have massive hardships that are caused by this war as it goes on. And there's this difference in degree between what you're used to and what you're getting. So when that difference isn't as great in some place like Iran, a blockade or an embargo doesn't quite have the same impact. It's a great question. Other questions? Yeah, Joe?
All right, in all honesty, what could we possibly take away from Iran that would equal taking away the German speaker? I feel like there isn't any.
Probably nothing. You're probably right. So, other questions?
Do you think the success of this is has demonstrated historically the effectiveness? I know it's not economic sanctions, but it is a de facto economic sanction. It's just done through military force, and the effectiveness of this. I mean,
Well, it was
so
certainly
the same way with North Korea or going back to Iran, any of these other nations.
Yeah. If you have enough buy-in.
Yeah.
As when it really bit home, when it really started to hurt, was when there was no neutral pressure anymore to keep it light. You know, once you had the United States backing the blockade, the British could really tighten the screws and do whatever they wanted to do. And they told countries like Holland and Denmark that basically we're cutting you down to less than what you imported in peacetime. Because if you want to import to Germany, you can, but it's coming out of what you produce internally, and you're going to cause hardship on your own people. So most of those countries stopped. They exported a little bit because the Germans were willing to pay so much, really, to get anything, that it was so lucrative they would still do some exporting. But as you saw, the imports really, really drop once the U.S. throws its weight into the blockade.